Everyone. It's lovely to see people at our lecture today. I'd like to welcome Dr. Sana Murrani, who will be giving us a creative talk about rupturing architecture. Sana Murrani is an architect and associate professor in spatial practice at the University of Plymouth and the author of Rupturing Architecture. In this volume, she critically and visually examines the spatial practices of refuge in Iraq over a 20-year period between 2003 and 2023. She explores how ordinary Iraqis respond to war, violence, and displacement through creative and adaptive refuge-making. She too has lived through these traumas. Sana highlights the resilience and ingenuity of her compatriots in transforming homes, urban spaces, and border geographies into places of refuge. Through methods such as creative deep mapping, memory work, storytelling, and interviews with 15 Iraqis, Rupturing Architecture uncovers the dual nature of rupture as both trauma and resistance. The fieldwork, Ruptured Domesticity, for this research project was funded by the British Institute for the Study of Iraq and the LSE Middle East Center. Sana is currently leading an AHRC Impact Accelerator Fellowship project alongside multidisciplinary artist Kimball Bumstead and a team of Yazidi researchers, which is titled Ruptured Atlas, Creative Mapping of Yazidi Odyssey of Home, Displacement, Migration, and Return. This project is in partnership with the Sinjar Academy, YESDA, IOM Iraq, and the LSE's Middle East Center. I'd like to welcome our speaker.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, Bissy, for having me. I think I'll do this because I will probably come sideways and start talking to you in different forms. I like to teach. I teach, and when I teach, I stand up and talk, and I wander around the students. I don't sit down. So this is going to be a bit more like this. But also to talk to you about the book, the work, and everything that has been happening in the past over 20 years now for me since I left Baghdad. The clicker doesn't want to click. No. We'll get there.
Let's go back. Should work. Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about the structure of the book before I get into the actual project that Bissy funded, which made the vast majority of part of the chapter a couple of chapters within the book. But the book starts with a very personal autoethnographic kind of story of my own relationship with the country, but also the Iraq that we know it now, the modern day Iraq, and also Mesopotamia, which is where my roots are from, and I will speak to you a little bit more about that. So there is a huge amount of personal input within the book, as well as the stories that I've encountered with other Iraqis. The first two chapters set out the conceptual framing of how I deal with few words which make up a big chunk of the work that I do, which is trauma, memory, and rupture. And this is the thing that I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. And then the last 2 chapters framed around a series of interviews that I did with Iraqis from across the country. And if it hadn't been for COVID, I think potentially the way that this research would have been conducted slightly differently, but it would have meant that I wouldn't have had access to the many different people that I managed to actually speak with from across the country, because it would have been an incredibly difficult kind of project to do on my own. And then the 4th chapter deals with a series of sites, architectural sites, but also kind of geographies that had a presence within the architectural history of the country, and from across the country, from the north to the south. And then I work with that on 3 ways of understanding trauma through a sudden, through mobility and through also the time and temporal kind of aspect of it. The book ends with a view onto architecture, but also the way we can encounter architecture from post-war countries, and in particular Iraq, through a manifesto. And the manifesto is on spatial justice, is trying to kind of understand how people respond creatively to the trauma and violence that they've encountered. So, very, very pleased to have my work funded through the British Institute of the Study of Iraq for part of the work. So BISI funded the entire project fieldwork, which ended up being an online fieldwork because of COVID, but it also meant that I was talking to people from across the country, and I'll explain from where. And also it funded a collection of an archive of the work, which you will see in the room next to where we are at the moment. I've set up a mini exhibition of the work that I've done. The work was commissioned and exhibited by at the LSE Middle East Center in 2023, marking 20 years since the 2003 invasion. And it was a very important moment in the book, but also in the history of how Iraq has been portrayed throughout the history of the past 20 years in the media, in Western contexts, and looking at it from the voices of Iraqis, which has been for quite some time a kind of a more quiet voice in the West. So this is the exhibition of the work, and we've got samples that it's exactly the same amount of work, but it's all kind of shrunk. So it's a smaller version of the exhibition that we had at LSE across that. In essence, the book really is about the relationship between people and their place, and how they make places creatively. But it's also about the storytelling within every single aspect of that encounter that I had with people. It really focuses on the creative aspects of how people responded to the trauma of violence. So throughout the book, you will see quite a lot of graphical representations of trauma. None of them is gory images of blood and destruction, which is what Iraq has been portrayed in the media for quite some time. And it's about how people responded to all of that, from the aspects of how they dealt with the changes in their homes, how they changed their cities, but also how they dealt with displacement, and it's saying restarting. Your computer has decided to restart in the middle of this. Stefan, how are you? I'll ad-lib. Here's the book. Is it going to come up? Or shall I ad-lib? Happy to ad-lib. I'll talk to you about the cover of the book, and then we can go through it very quickly when it comes, because there is a slide on there. I said that the book started as a personal story, and this is a very personal front cover. The background of the book cover is an orange blanket that I left Iraq with from Baghdad through Jordan to Amman, because that was the only way that you can leave Iraq in 2003 after the collapse of the regime, the Saddam regime. And I left on my own, and it was the first time that I am leaving the country without my parents. We've traveled before in the past. My dad was working for the UN for quite some time when I was a child, and we traveled together. So I've been out of the country before, but I've never been out on my own. I also have never been out knowing that potentially I'm not returning. And this was, I left to come and do a PhD. I had a position at a university in the UK to start a PhD, and they didn't know what to do with me. So when I went to the embassy in Amman, the consulate there was saying to me that you are going to be the first PhD student to enter the UK from Baghdad since the collapse of the regime. I still had my Iraqi passport, which had Saddam's photo on the front, and they didn't know what to do, so they ended up putting my visa on a separate kind of clipped piece of paper saying, well, it's all going to be thrown in the bin and you're going to have a new thing coming out. 4 years later, I was still carrying this thing, going to conferences with an attached, literally clipped piece of thing that caused a huge amount of problems for me going in and out of place. But this cover has the background of that blanket that my mum unsewn the seam of the blanket, of my orange blanket, which is my childhood blanket, and put money in the seam and then kind of stitched on top of it again. And because she was worried that potentially I will be stopped, the car will be stopped in the road between Baghdad and Amman, and they will take everything from us, if not kill us potentially. But I felt that it was a form of my comfort when I was young to then turn into a kind of an object of resistance when I left Iraq with. So it became a cover. Bloomsbury were absolutely amazing at allowing me the freedom to do all of that. If it had been Routledge or any other architecture publishing house would have probably not allowed as much freedom. They really understood the stories within the work, and they allowed me the access to actually represent not only myself but also the voices of others. And then there is an imposed map of Baghdad, for those of you who can recognize the river, and the buildings where I lived, which is in, thank you for fixing, so now we can resume. So every single aspect of the stories that you see in here, every single one of those fold-out maps is a story, is taking an element of the trauma that they shared with me, and I turned it into a three-dimensional space. Some of those are imagined spaces, so they're not a clear, immediate depiction, a physical depiction of exactly those kind of environments, but they are a mix between my own interpretation, but also the stories that they gave. All of the photographs are theirs, so they parted with the photographs that they wanted me to share with the research. And they also, I included an enormous amount of text. So the book has very lengthy quotes from the people that I have worked with from across the country. And it was intentional that I keep their voice, not to limit it to snippets of short paragraphs, but actually to include it in the lengthy kind of way, because again, this was one of the first places where people were actually talking and someone was listening, and it was being documented. So a lot of what I was trying to do is to listen to those stories, but also understand what was happening in the rest of the country from the minute we were invaded in 2003 because I was in Baghdad. I'm from Amriya, for those of you who know the geography of the city, which has become since, the place of insurgency and so on. And since then we left the country, but I lived nearly my entire life, apart from the few years when we were away in there. But you see those circles, so there are circles from 1 to 15 from across the country. And those circles indicate a person that I spoke to from across the country. So I made sure that I've spoken to both male and female, and in fact I had more females spoken to me than male participants in the project. I spoke to all fractions of society, all religious and ethnic minorities, as well as ethnic backgrounds within the country. And all of this was very much intentional to bring a picture that is balanced, but also for it not to just be a monolithic voice about what Iraq is. And in exactly the same way that the voices were different, the trauma was different, and the stories that came from all parts of the country were different. Some of the questions that I was asking people were literally what was happening. So, for example, when I spoke to people in Kurdistan, I was saying to them, tell me what was happening in Kurdistan when we were all getting bombed in Baghdad during the first few days and weeks of the invasion. And it was really interesting the way that those stories, which spanned the 20 years, kept on shifting and moving from one story that was happening in 2003 to immediately the story after something that happened during the sectarian violence or towards the end of the sectarian violence, which was right towards the end of that time. Actually, there were quite a few... did we skip? No, we didn't skip. I'll come back to something if we skipped it. But the work that I did in the end focus on is the stories that talked about how the home was changed and modified to basically take the impact. And I speak from a personal experience, but I also speak from a collective experience across the country and how people dealt with that, and how people dealt with destruction and lived through destruction. Especially, this is an example of Mosul. So you see this wreckage in here, photographed by Ali Baroudi, a photographer in Mosul. I also focused on the collapse, coherent nature, and the mixed kind of ethnic and religious backgrounds in Baghdad in particular during the sectarian violence. And what happened to the city from an urban kind of context within that. And I also spoke to people who are still now in camps in the north of Iraq and elsewhere, displaced by very different things across the 20 years. Some were displaced because of ISIS. Others were displaced because of destruction to their homes through shelling and so on. But more recently, we're seeing a vast number of displaced people in informal settlements from the collapse of the environmental degradation that's going on, deforestation and so on, and people losing their livelihoods and having to be displaced into suburbs and edges of cities as well. So I mentioned this word rupture, but also the book actually starts with an explanation of what rupture is and what refuge-making is. But I like this, so this is what I kind of tried to frame. In order for architects to make something, they have to break for them to make something. So this is what I tell my students all the time: we have to dig, we have to break the ground to build something. We have to take down a tree to make, the beams that we use if we're using trees, which is the kind of, but we have to break something in order for us to make. So the way I use rupture is not just as a tool of destruction, but it's also potentially, if we look at the flip side, is also how we make a place, how we create something new. We have to break something to make something new. And in that way, if we look at rupture in those two ways, then refuge becomes a really interesting and very shifting kind of conceptual framing to a way of resisting all of that damage and break. And it's a kind of reinstating an agency that that people were losing, but also it's a form of resistance. So this is why I talk about it from that framing, which is a framing of resistance. So that dual, but also a kind of a conceptual meaning and framing of rupture as a constructive process and a destructive force was very much an intentional kind of way of understanding refuge. Right, it's not doing it again. Right. Before I go a little bit more in the individual stories in depth, I wanted to give an overview of the kind of, well, ruptures, but also the history of trauma that the country has been through. And this is really only the history of in early 1900s, but the actual history with trauma and invasions and so on happened thousands and hundreds of years before that. Before the colonization of Britain, we had the Ottoman Empire, which lasted for over 5 centuries. So there is a lot of troubled and trauma geographies that emerged from that. But this is really to frame a bit why there is a kind of a history that reaches back beyond the 20 years of the framing of the book, and it's definitely beyond the 2003, and it dates back to the previous wars that happened. I was born in the 70s. I was born in Baghdad, but my parents, both of them, come from Murrani, which is in the south of the country. It's on the border nearly between Iran and Iraq. Mesopotamian by origin. My parents are actually from Babylonian history. We have been genetically tested because my dad is a geneticist, and he was absolutely adamant that we need to trace our history. I'm from a minority group in the country, which are called the Mandaeans. And at the moment, I think there are about 5 families left in the entire country, very few in the southern part of the country, and I do not have any immediate family left in the country. So with that history, there are layers of other minority groups and people who have also had a type of a slow violence inflicted on them, rather than the kind of genocide that happened in the north of Iraq on the Yazidis, which I've been involved with, not as involved with, no, I've been working with people who were survivors of that part. But I want to explain the map, because the map is slightly different to what you see on Google Map. So all of that green part of the... Yay! Brilliant, thank you. All of this green part in the center was the heart of Mesopotamia. So it crosses Iran, it crosses Syria. Obviously, the majority of it is in Iraq, but also it reaches into Turkey. Modern-day Iraq is divided through the League of Nations, and this is when the borders started to emerge. But before that, when it was the Ottoman Empire, it was all really one big, massive mess. This red line is the Kurdish part of the country. But really the Kurds would love to have a little bit more, and they have been calling for an increase in that part. Obviously they would love to have Kirkuk because it's got oil, and Mosul in exactly the same way. There is another political line which is non-existent, just like this one, as in there is no actual border, but physical border, but certainly there is a very clear Shia stronghold enclave in the south of the country, who were oppressed for years, and I'm probably preaching to people who already know the story of the country. So the country, even without the involvement of external intruders, it was already feeling that tension in several parts of its composition. It doesn't like me. I was born in Amriya. It's one of the places that during the 70s, big plots of land on the edge of the city then, but now they became part of the city, were given to academics. My dad is an academic. Were given to academics to basically have an entire neighborhood which was predominantly academic kind of owners. My dad built the house, and it was our first owned property. And we lived there until we had to leave. My parents would not have left, and if you ask them now, do you want to go back, they will say yes. But we lived there throughout the Iran-Iraq War and what happened afterwards with the 1991. And for those of you who also know anything about the particular geography of that part, we're very close to the airport, which means every single invasion starts with bombing the airport, which means it's literally on our backyard. The formation of the green zone, which is the international, where it used to be the international zone, where it used to be the government, the main government, is really the main road that leads from the airport to that part in the center of Iraq. And on the other side, so this is the road that I took, Abu Ghraib, to get out of the country, is the notorious prison, which became a big story in 2003, when the Americans went in and took lots of photographs of detainees there with obscene kind of photographs. So we live in there, and as an architect, I have lived always with this very difficult relationship to the profession. The profession is about building. But I lived through several years of destruction. And for a person who is very much aware of how the profession operates in the sense that it's all about building, yet I am surrounded by so much damage and destruction to buildings and to livelihoods, I always had this very difficult relationship as to whether I do want to be that kind of architect. So I've always spoken about architecture, and you will see I call the work that I do spatial practice, which is a field, an expanded version of the field that includes architecture, but it's not limited just to architecture, because it includes also the urban studies context. It also includes the material culture, and people who work with human and urban geography would understand the kind of expansion of that phrase. And because of that, I was more drawn to an understanding of architecture through maps, and I draw maps quite a lot of the time, but it's always those counter maps, the maps that are critical, that don't just come from Google Maps, that are really trying to show something that is hidden and different, and it reveals something that it doesn't exist, potentially, or exist within. So these are some of the stories. one of the biggest kind of pieces that I felt that the book managed to do is create empathy across the big different parts of the country. Baghdadis, but also other parts of the country who had so much pain throughout the years of violence, but also before that, the several wars, always had a resentment towards the Kurds because they were always safe. They were never bombed by foreign countries. They enabled the access of the Americans to Baghdad in 2003. So there was always this resentment. What happened to you? My suffering is more than your suffering. Little we knew that in 2003, when we were sat in corners of rooms, changed our whole entire living spaces to hide from the debris and the shattering glass and so on, they were doing exactly the same because they were petrified by a repetition of the massacre that happened in Halabja in 1988 when Saddam had ordered a chemical attack on them, and a huge part of that community was lost. So they were living in the fear of a similar trauma to the one that we were living, yet theirs was completely silent. So the entire city fell dead in the cities in Kurdistan during that time until Saddam was found, because they were worried about him retaliating because they enabled access through the American troops. And what was really telling by a story like this is that, no, actually, your suffering is just as bad as my suffering. It's just a different type of suffering, and we're all having this kind of relationship between how do we then engage with that history of suffering. I call this a palimpsest of trauma, and in the book I explain what a palimpsest is. The palimpsest, from a historical kind of records perspective, is when you look at layers of text from history and you start to kind of peel and understand things in relation to other layers and other time frames. But I found that very much a spatial tool to understand how people were operating during that period. This is an example from Mosul. The quote, as well as the photograph, is by my friend, photographer Ali Baroudi, who went around the entire part of the old city, which was completely destroyed by ISIS, but also the retaliating to eradicate ISIS, the war that happened against ISIS in Mosul. And what's really interesting about something like this is that some of those houses were absolutely fine. So these were, all of the old houses were revisited by demining teams to check whether there are mines or whether there are unexploded bombs and so on. And when they check them, they mark them and they put a tick and they say Amen, which means they're safe. So they were trying to tell the people, you can go back, it's okay. Yet, years after the locks are still on, people don't have trust in that return, and some of them still choose to live in camps over returning to potentially a dangerous part of the city. I mentioned that I worked with Yazidis, and I did a project that followed the work that I did with them on the book, which was focused on the survivors of the genocide in the north of Iraq, who for the past 10 years have been displaced and still are displaced, and they're kind of falling in between the central government in Baghdad and the Kurdish government as well. No one wants to have to kind of provide for them, but also there is very little hope of them returning to homes to rebuild. And some of the stories that they were talking about made this edition that we had within the book to discuss refuge in the movements that people were making rather than in the physical entity within a home or a house. So people found refuge in the escape routes that they took to the mountain, and this is how they describe refuge to me. So they were saying, I don't feel a sense of belonging or a home to the wreckage that it became in Sinjar, our village, and so on. But I do feel that refuge and a sense of belonging to that mountain that basically saved us. This is how they see the mountain, which changed the way that we were looking at how refuge is constructed. There were several stories. This is one other one in Mahmoudiyya, which is south of Baghdad. And this young woman who was at the time in 2003 a child, but she's now an adult, and she was talking to me about her experience. And this is when we understood that the scale of violence came and happened through different frames, not just at the scale of the building, not just the scale of the city, but even to the underwear that had to be hidden in black plastic bags when the Americans were going around houses trying to find insurgents, but also kind of not really paying attention, but also deliberately violating people's privacy by looking through drawers and searching through things. So for her mother to hide the underwear in black plastic bags is just to kind of keep whatever dignity she can protect, but it was that kind of element of those scales of violence that we were talking about that I was really interested in highlighting as well. I use maps, and I mentioned this when the computer went a bit bust. This is the bit that I was going to explain how I use maps. So you will see that there are some geographical positionings and things that we take from Google Maps for particular locations, but there are also objects which are very much rooted and related to identity. So like my blanket, this attire, which is the Yazidi attire, which became a big kind of element within the Yazidi identity, because they wanted to kind of bring out all of that. But what I was really trying to say in here is that I found in the use of map as a tool or as a method, it allowed me the same plasticity, but also the kind of transferability of those very difficult moments of memory and trauma and the spaces that we were talking about. So it allowed me this ability to visualize, but also to talk about these undocumented parts of the work. There is a quote by Paolo Boccani, who's a migration sociologist, and he talks about refuge-making as homing, and I love that word homing, because he adds an ing to the word home, because he says it's always a struggle in the making, so it's never a static kind of thing. But I add to it that it's also an act of resistance, and I found that even in the simplest ways, putting underwear in black, bags was an act of resistance to this violation of existence. And it's a struggle, it's always a struggle. This was the bit where I was going to tell you about the book cover, which we've covered, but this map is a personal map of my journey, but also what happened and how we moved from one place to another. I start parts of my story with the trauma of the 1991 double rockets that hit the Amriya shelter. So there are two shelters in Amriya. They are equal distance to our house, and we chose to be in one and not the other that got hit. And in 1991, people did use the public shelters as shelters. But past that point, when 500 people were killed inside, including many children, it was full. People then abandoned those shelters across the country. Predominantly, their existence is in Baghdad. They were built by two European companies, which was obsessed by building shelters across Europe during the Cold War. And Saddam recruited them to build shelters in the 80s in the country. The majority of them, 23 of them out of the 26, were all inside Baghdad. And I traced back the company, which is now not the same company, it changed hands and so on, to understand how that commissioning happened. But I didn't get to the bottom of it, but I did speak to quite a few people about this. But what was really interesting about those particular kind of examples within the public existence of the city is that since 1991, they just became an eyesore, concrete blocks between neighborhoods that filled with houses. People avoided them. They were always associated with Saddam putting ammunition inside, and no one wanted to come anywhere near them. But also, they were always associated with masculine kind of recreational activities, like being a gym and being a place where people played badminton and that sort of stuff. But it was always a place for men, so women didn't go in. But I've been in one of them, which was the one that wasn't bombed, and we left 2 days before that bomb fell. So our windows broke when the shell happened on that. But I start the story by talking about them as an example of this trauma that dates back. So things did not start in 2003, and this was the kind of the story that I tell. I speak about the city in so many different ways, and one of the stories is how someone who has left Iraq at the same time as I did, gone back and reconciled with the city again, and we just had a conversation about this. I found it an incredibly traumatic experience to ask me to go back to my own home country, and because I don't have any family, I would probably have to stay in a hotel. So the idea of going and staying in a hotel in Baghdad is incredibly traumatizing for me, just the thought of it. But this friend of mine who ended up going back, she's now become a friend when this was the interview going, had that relationship. She left during the sectarian violence. And during the sectarian violence, the city was littered with blast walls across the entire city centre in particular. And it was intentionally that those blast walls were moved quite frequently around, shifted about the city for security reasons, because the occupying forces did not want the insurgents to plot against them and do explosives and suicide bombs and so on. So these would appear, and then markets would appear, and then a network of the famous orange taxis would start to network between each other, saying, I'm going to drop this family that I'm carrying near this opening, near this market. They're going to come through and across that market behind the mosque, and I need you to pick them up from there because they need to go there. But I can't get to there because of the blast walls. And it was really interesting to start to think how the creative responses that several layers of society started to deal with this incredible spatial violence structures that were imposed onto cities. I did speak about the Yazidis, so this is one of the other project that I did with them, and there is a document that you can take with you, which we will talk about there. I won't talk to you about. Just before we finish, I love to end on, I see it as a high. This was a high moment for the country, in my opinion. I know a lot of people see it as potentially a disruptive time. But since the collapse of the Saddam regime, and I remember when I was young in university there and being harassed regularly to join the party, and I refused, and I always used the fact that I need to study as an excuse. It didn't always work, and I was harassed to the point at one point I was left with bits of threatening letters on the windscreen of my car, and so on. So when the regime collapsed and people became able to talk freely, it was a moment that I didn't live it there because I was out of the country. So when the 2019 Tishreen October movement happened, I felt an immediate sense of wanting to jump into that square in Baghdad, in Tahrir Square, with every single one of them. And in fact, I developed an obsession of following them 24/7 on every single social media channel. But it was also an incredible representation of how peaceful yet creative revolutions could happen. And I know they didn't get everything they wanted. But what was really exciting, and I take it as a case study, and I talk about the building that they transformed from an architectural perspective. I worked for an architectural practice, which was one of the top architectural practices in the country, after I finished my degree, and it was on the 10th floor before this building became what it is at the moment. And this was right in the center of Baghdad, on top of a very exciting big part of a square which is called Tahrir Square. Not just in Egypt there is Tahrir Square, there is another one in Iraq and others in the Arab world across all nations. But I speak about it from the architecture of the actual discarded but also unoccupied and underused building that they turned into the center of the movement, and also speak about the tuk-tuk, which is an element of that exact change in the mentality of people where you have given up. So those are young people. They're not old enough to be driving a car, so they end up driving a tuk-tuk. They're usually from a very deprived part of the country, but they're also associated with kids who are not educated and troubled and so on. Those kids have had no encounter with the way other people have encountered the old kind of network of society within the city where women and men worked hand in hand together. So they didn't understand to begin with what their responses would be to an incredibly peaceful, multi-ethnic, incredibly creative part of the history that they were in the making. And they became crucial because the tuk-tuk is small and narrow, it could go through very small and narrow places and over and above what canisters were thrown at them, gas canisters and all kinds, and killing so many of them, including the person who started the whole thing. But they had a very powerful kind of, and also an important role they played in that resistance movement by rescuing people from the ground who were injured and bringing them back to the center of the square for them to be treated by, again, people from the movement who were doctors and nurses and other students of nursing and doctors. My last slide is how the book ends, which it ends with a manifesto. And the manifesto really talks about the three things that I spoke to you about. But it really is a call for action, is a focus on a trauma-informed kind of practice, is an understanding that memory of trauma and trauma has to be understood in the framing of the country historically, but also in relation to all of what goes on before we start to make a place again, before we start to rebuild. It also puts out a plurality to the meaning of refuge. As I explained it, it's not just about the home, it's about all kinds and sorts of those parts of resistance that happened within the country. And it calls for participation as from the community that it serves before justice can actually start to happen. That is me. There is a QR code, but there is also a leaflet, flyers, which you guys can pick up for a discounted version of my book. It's still expensive, unfortunately. So it came out in October 2024, and Bloomsbury and every single publishing house for academics has to bring it out in hardback, very expensive, £85, but I do have a special discount, and I've got copies if you are inclined to buy one with a discount that makes it £55 a copy. I completely understand if you don't want to part with £55 today, but in 18 months, less, it should be now 14 months, the book will come out in paperback, and then it will be a much affordable price at £22. So if you want to hold back, I completely understand. Thank you.